My name is Patrick Deneen. I'm on the faculty here in the political science department at the University of Notre Dame. And I apologize for my tardiness. We had a department meeting today. The disadvantage of being on campus, your own campus, is you can't escape things like this, perhaps as many of you are escaping today. Delighted to be able to chair this session, a lecture by Tristram Engelhardt, who holds degrees in both medicine and philosophy. He is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rice University and professor emeritus in the Department of Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine. In addition to having authored only 300 articles and chapters of books, as well as having co-edited 30 volumes, his books include The Foundations of Bioethics, which has appeared in Chinese, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish. Bioethics and Secular Humanism, The Search for a Common Morality, which has also appeared in Chinese, and The Foundations of Christian Bioethics, which has appeared in Portuguese and Romanian. He is the editor of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy and two-book series, Philosophy and Medicine and Philosophical Studies in Contemporary Culture. And he is the founding senior editor of Christian Bioethics. His lecture today is entitled Jerusalem versus Athens. Jerusalem versus Athens, Critical Reflections on the Body in a Postmodern Space. And after his remarks, I'll introduce his commentator, Gary Anderson.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. I am a bit disabled in voice, so I hope I will be understandable. Don't become panicked if you see an Irish woman in the back of the room waving her hands. That's my wife. That means she can't understand me. St. Paul's report at the Areopagus in Athens concerning a Savior who rose from the dead provoked disagreement. For many Greek philosophers, the intellect was incorruptible and the body corruptible. The body was surely not destined to live forever. In contrast, Christians preach a bodily life after death, as the 11th statement of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed affirms, quote, I look for the resurrection of the dead. Matthew's Gospel tells us that after Christ's death, quote, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. This account contrasts with Platonic and Neoplatonic themes in Greek philosophy, in which disembodied intellects are immortal, but not the body. Western Christianity has, in complex ways, been influenced by this view, which this paper addresses only one element of contemporary views of the body, the loss of the project of the sanctification of the body. This loss underlies the contemporary dominant secular culture's radical demoralization of sexual activity and reproduction into matters of lifestyle choices. At the outset, I must give a number of disclosures or warnings. They will take me about half of my presentation. However, once my points of departure are clear, so too will be my conclusions, even if you disagree with them. The first disclosure concerns the immediate purpose of this presentation, a better understanding of the watershed change in Western public sexual and reproductive morality over the last half-century, and how this change is connected with an alteration in the manner in which the body is appreciated in the dominant culture. Sexual activity and reproduction have been demoralized into lifestyle choices as the West became fully post-Christian. It is no longer a subject of guilt and or shame to have sex or live together outside of wedlock. Moreover, it is no longer a subject of guilt or shame to have children outside of wedlock. This is not the claim that in the past, fornication and adultery were infrequent, or that many did not give issue to illegitimates. What is different is that in the past, vice, through hypocrisy, regularly paid tribute to virtue. Sexual and reproductive indiscretions, ceteris paribus, came with official social disapproval and established social costs. However, much honored in the breach, there were publicly established sexual mores that reflected traditional Christian commitments and views of the body. This is no longer the case. Western public sexual and reproductive mores have changed fundamentally. In the process, the meaning of the body in Western culture has changed as well. Although the recent changes were long in coming, and although they have deep roots in Western culture, the changes over the last half-century have been relatively dramatic. To give an example from Germany, as it was before the recent transformations, on the 6th of March, 1970, I took my wife to the University Hospital in Bonn, Germany, so that she could be delivered of our second child. I was there on a Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship, studying Kant and Hegel. On entering the hospital, the admitting clerks asked for proof of marriage in order to determine whether to record our child as legitimate or as a bastard. Not having traveled to Germany with a copy of our marriage license, I explained to the hospital officials that we were citizens of Texas and that a common law marriage was sufficient to ensure legitimacy. Then I elaborate that the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for a common law marriage were that the couple be male and female, that they hold themselves out openly and notoriously to be husband and wife, and that they have had sexual intercourse. As I point out, we manifestly met the conditions. The next morning, after the birth of our daughter, I was visited in my wife's room by a hospital official who joyfully informed me that he had called the American embassy in Petersburg, which had confirmed that my account of common law marriage in Texas was correct. My daughter would be registered as legitimate and not as a bastard. In contrast, the Evangelische Kirche Deutschlands, which I'll refer to from now on as EKD, this June asked for the erasure from German public consciousness of distinctions such as between legitimate and illegitimate. In the statement, the EKD sought to forge a view of the family that encompassed not just the family with children constituted by a husband and wife, but single-parent families as well as homosexual unions. Absent any recognition that sexual activity or reproduction outside of marriage was wrong. The body was assumed to be open to peaceable consensual use in sexual activity and reproduction. The body, qua body, has come at least implicitly to be regarded as an instrument for peaceable sexual reproductive use by consenting persons. The body is not seen as bringing with it constraining norms. The view advanced by the AKD regarding sexual acts and reproduction is, to say the least, somewhat distant from the position taken by St. Paul in his first letters to the Corinthians. I'll quote from the 6th chapter. The body was not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two shall become one flesh. But he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body. But he who commits sin sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at great price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Unlike the statement of the AKD, St. Paul gives special attention to the evil of fornication. In our dominant culture, this attention by itself is astonishing enough. The reason for St. Paul's position is even more culturally alien. The special evil of illicit sexual unions lies in uniting one's body with the body of another person who is not one's spouse. More precisely, the evil is best understood in terms of a use of one's body that is improper and being incompatible with sanctification. Sexual intercourse for traditional Christians is a serious matter because of the union effected between the two bodies. As Christ puts it with regard to marriage, the two shall become one flesh. The body is central. While the marriage bed is undefiled, that of fornicators is defiled. Quoting from Hebrews, let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed be kept undefiled, for God will judge fornicators and adulterers. This view has remained integral to traditional Christianity. St. Paul's statements should not be taken to deny that before Christ, patriarchs and kings were at liberty without wrongdoing to have concubines, a point attested to in Genesis and elsewhere, and about which Moses Maimonides reflects in the Mishnah Torah. The issue of concubinage is complex, but irrelevant to us after Christ. Now, concubinage and more broadly, fornication are materially equivalent. Unabsolved fornicators who have not been restored to the chalice are barred from receiving communion, which of course is a cardinal criterion for traditional Christians. When before the distribution of the holy gifts, the deacon says, with fear of God and faith and love draw near. This one reminds congregants that one should not approach the chalice until one has prayed, fasted, and with the approval of one's spiritual father. The liturgy, guided by the canons, takes account of what has happened to the body. In the dominant secular culture, in contrast, the very notion of sexual immorality has become a puzzling concept, if not an inaccessible notion. A complex set of changes has altered a broad sweep of everyday life, changing the life world and the experience of the body within the dominant culture. The use of the body in sexual activity and reproduction has been demoralized into a lifestyle choice. The use of the body in sexual activity it involves choices that persons within the dominant sexual culture should not find right or wrong, good or bad. The peaceable consensual use of the body in sexual activity and reproduction is no longer a moral matter in the dominant secular culture. Today, I will principally address how, within the life world of the dominant secular culture, sex and reproduction outside of marriage have become as unproblematic as having a meal on the run. As Gianni Vattimo puts it, belief in the importance of sexuality in human life is gradually waning. How could this watershed change in public culture have occurred? In addressing this question, I will not attempt to identify necessary or sufficient conditions for the changes. Instead, I will advance for consideration one factor: the loss in the West of a key understanding about the body that has made this change easier. The dominant secular culture, given its commitments, can no longer acknowledge the project of sanctifying the body. This failure appropriately to appreciate the body has roots, I will note, in the Western moral philosophical project of specifying and justifying through reason the appropriate character of the moral life. The good, the right, and the virtues came to be understood without any necessary reference to the holy, much less to the body. However, for traditional Christians, the sanctification of the body can only be understood in terms of an encounter with the transcendently holy. In particular, the inability of the dominant secular culture properly to appreciate the importance of the body in the human encounter with the transcendently holy is a function of contemporary Western thought, having given central place to a view of the moral agent as an agent whose body is defined within a philosophical space that is now recognized as social-historically conditioned context that has no roots in a reality that exists apart from the vicissitudes of culture and paradigm. The body is now understood in terms of the narratives that persons tell about their bodies. What can I say in one lecture without employing violent oversimplification? Having gestured towards a theological understanding, let me do the same for the secular understanding I am placing in contrast. Surely a number of views could be advanced about how one ought to characterize the now dominant secular culture and its appreciation of the body. To keep this presentation within limits, I will seemingly arbitrarily identify only one dimension of the contemporary secular culture for particular attention, one that has roots in a way of looking at the human condition that grew out of the Enlightenment through Kant, and then was importantly transformed by cultural forces, crucially appreciated and reinforced by, among other people, Hegel. The result is the contemporary postmodern view of the moral life in which each person is free peaceably with consensual others to have and pursue his own vision of sexual and reproductive flourishing. The meaning of the body is nested within the narrative of the spirit. As already indicated, it is a view through which the traditional Christian sexual reproductive morality that was still embraced by Kant became demoralized and deflated, in that much of what had been understood as moral choices regarding sexuality and reproduction became personal lifestyle choices. As a consequence, heterosexual marriage and the traditional family have at the very least been culturally marginalized. As Hegel realized, Kant's morality, which Kant sets after Christ as Messiah and God, cannot be sustained. It became a morality in a Christianity without God. Now, for a further and important warning or disclosure, in my reflections on Christianity, indeed on morality, I proceed as an Orthodox Christian. This approach can but sound odd to the non-Orthodox. Let me underscore some of the oddities so that you can at least appreciate what they involve. For example, we know that the Bible is not revelation. It is rather a record of revelation. More than that, although the work of biblical scholars may be intellectually very interesting, it is theologically irrelevant for understanding the Bible as Orthodox Christianity understands the Bible. This is the case because we recognize that theologians are, first and foremost, people who know God, not just about God. There are these people. But let me assure you, I'm not one of them. I only report on what these people say, not being myself a theologian in the strict sense. As Metropolitan Hilarion recently summarized the point at the University of Toronto in 2008, quote, true theology is born out of a silent and humble standing before God rather than out of speculations on theological matters. As Father John Romanides has put it, the fathers do not say anything about God on the basis of philosophical reflection. They do not sit at their desks like scholastics in order to do theology. Because when the church fathers theologize, speculation or reflection is strictly forbidden, close quote. Theology in the strict sense is an ascetic, not an academic endeavor. Further, on the issue of understanding the Bible, one might consider a statement of Archimandrite Vasileus of the Holy Mountain, namely, outside the church, the gospel is a sealed and incomprehensible book. The point is that the meaning of passages in the Bible receive their authoritative exposition through becoming part of the prayer of the church, most especially the liturgy. The liturgy has a special epistemic privilege or standpoint. As a consequence, as you will see, I will quote from the liturgy as many Western Christians quote from the Bible. This is the case because, again, quoting from Metropolitan Hilarion, the theological authority of liturgical texts is higher than that of the works of the fathers of the church. For not everything in the works of the latter is of equal theological value, and not everything has been accepted by the fullness of the church. Liturgical texts, on the contrary, have been accepted by the whole church as a rule of faith, for they have been read or sung everywhere in Orthodox churches over many centuries. Throughout this time, many erroneous ideas foreign to Orthodoxy that may have crept in either through misunderstanding or oversight were eliminated by church tradition itself, leaving only pure and authentic doctrine clothed by the poetic forms of the church's hymns. Archimandrite Vasileus makes a similar point. Among the creedal and dogmatic monuments of the Orthodox Catholic Church are the liturgies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great, complete with their typicon, or liturgical rubrics, and the actual manner of their celebration. For it is not only the prayers with dogmatic content, but the whole liturgical action and the life of the church that constitutes a unique theological witness and grace. Note that this involves not just what the celibates sing or say during the liturgy, but how the celibates move their body. Rituals count. My epistemic position and its implications thus involve understandings in profound contrast with the dominant secular culture. The basic premises and rules of evidence on which I am drawing are not those to which the dominant culture appeals. However, they lie at the foundations of a major Christian approach to the body, an approach anchored in the experience of the early church. The body is central in the life of the church. This is the case because, among other things, the bodies of true theologians, the bodies of holy fathers and mothers, have been sanctified so that to touch them is to make physical contact with the uncreated energies of God. It is for this reason that we seek to touch relics. It is for this reason that relics are placed in the altars of churches, becoming central as a result to the liturgy. Indeed, Canon 7 of the Seventh Ecumenical Council affirms the tradition of always having relics in the altar of a church. It is also for this reason that one seeks physically to receive the blessing of Holy Fathers. As Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomeus I has remarked concerning the sanctification of the body, quote, the change of man's essence, theosis by grace, is a fact that is tangible for all the Orthodox faithful. Grace is not only obtained through the transformed relics of saints, which is totally inexplicable without the acceptance of the divine. Grace also radiates from the living saints who are truly in the likeness of the Lord. Grace can also be obtained by the presence of the saints of what they have influenced and sanctified and to a degree transformed natural objects and places. At stake is that sanctification of the body recorded in the 19th chapter of Acts regarding the living body of Paul. Quote, God did extraordinary miracles through Paul so that when the handkerchief or aprons that touched his skin were brought to the sick, their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out. St. Paul's body was sanctified. To touch his body was to make contact with the uncreated energies of God. Because of this early Christian appreciation of the sanctification of the body, there was from Christianity's beginning a concern to gather up the relics of the martyrs. Even after their death, their bodies remained sanctified. For example, the martyrdom of Polycarp records that after his death, quote, the jealous and envious evil one who resists the family of the righteous, when he saw the greatness of his martyrdom and his blameless career from the beginning, and that he was crowned with the crown of immortality and had carried off the unspeakable prize, took care that not even his poor body should be taken away by us, though many desired to do this, and to have fellowship with his holy flesh. Then the martyrdom reports that after St. Polycarp's body was burned by the Romans, quote, we at last took up his bones, more precious than precious stones, and finer than gold, and put them where it was meet. The body of St. Polycarp was holy. The Christians were interested in the relics of St. Polycarp because St. Polycarp's body had been sanctified. This understanding is vividly alive in Orthodox Christianity, which recognizes the importance of sanctifying both body and soul. Due to the importance of the sanctification of the body, during the liturgy, the priest asks in the prayer of the thrice holy hymn, quote, pardon us every transgression, both voluntary and involuntary. Sanctify our souls and bodies. We seek not just that our souls become holy, but that our bodies become holy as well. Again, in the parable for the gospel, the priest says, "For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God." There is no sense of seeking a spiritual transformation apart from the body. The body is no mere prison of the soul. The same can be understood when, after the second litany of the faithful, in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the priest asks God to cleanse our souls and bodies from every defilement of flesh or spirit. One seeks through grace, that is, through the uncreated energies of God, not just to transform the soul, but also the body. The body is recognized as being open to both sanctification and defilement. It is for this reason, among others, that we have the fast. This view of the body in the liturgy is radically different from the view within the now dominant secular culture. Note that in none of these reflections have I engaged in a philosophical argument, advanced sensu stricto, regarding the sanctification of the body. Instead, I have pointed in an empirical fashion to instances of the sanctification of the body, as well as to how to pursue sanctification. One is pointed to contexts, such as the liturgy, within which sanctification is pursued and achieved. For those outside of Orthodox Christianity, this eschewal of philosophical argument, even systematic analysis, may seem at best astonishing. However, as the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomeus I stresses, quote, Orthodox Christianity does not live in a place of theoretical and conceptual conversations, but rather in a place of an essential and empirical lifestyle and reality confirmed by grace in the heart. The ecumenical patriarch is reminding us that we know of the sanctification of the body not through argument that lead to a conclusion, but instead we are brought to a view due to an encounter with the reality of grace, with the uncreated energies of God. This approach of traditional Christianity is not the approach to the body or morality that characterizes the contemporary dominant secular culture. Traditional Christianity is nested within a life world quite different from that of this culture. In the contemporary dominant culture, one finds instead a narrative cut off from any anchor in being beyond the being, supported by particular narratives, sustained within within particular free-floating accounts, all articulated within the horizon of the finite namely. How did we end up in this current state of affairs? Faced with the challenges posed by David Hume, Immanuel Kant attempted not only to save the necessity of claims made by Euclid, by Euclidean geometry or Newtonian physics, but to preserve the content and binding force of Christian morality, but without Christ as God. To be clear about my views regarding Kant, I agree with Manfred Kuhn's argument that Kant was an atheist. In anticipation of Elizabeth Anscombe's recognition of the impossibility of traditional moral obligations without God, Kant affirmed the practical moral postulates of God and immortality. Kant's grand approach, grounded among other things in his solution to the third antinomy, the issue as to whether humans are causally determined or free, led Kant to conceiving of moral agents apart from a causal nexus, including social historically conditioned forces. The solution to the third antinomy imposes a cleft between humans as bodies and humans as free persons. This approach made impossible any appreciation of the sanctification of the body. the rejection of which had already been underscored in the destruction of relics during the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution. Hegel realized that the emerging secular culture has taken things much further. The dominant secular culture had radically recast traditional Western Christian views through averting the cultural gaze from everything that claimed to be in itself apart from its being for us. This is the force of Hegel's famous pronouncement in 1802 in Glauben and Wissen of God's death. As Hegel acknowledged in his essay, Glauben and Wissen, everything has changed. Hegel recognized recognized the change as reflected in, quote, the feeling that God himself is dead, upon which the religion of more recent times rests. At stake was not simply a Kantian reduction of Christianity to morality, but a recasting of religion fully within the ambit of human culture. Geist. As Hegel put it, everything must be placed within the demands of philosophy, or properly, the intellectual conceits of the age. This perspective, quote, must reestablish for philosophy the idea of absolute freedom, and along with it, the absolute passion, the speculative Good Friday, in place of the historic Good Friday. Good Friday must be speculatively reestablished in the whole truth and harshness of its God-forsakenness. Everything, including first and foremost Western Christianity, was in the process of being placed within the horizon of the finite and the immanent. The transcendent was to be fully located within the immanence of thought. Without a transcendent, God's eye perspective, as he puts it in Glauben and Wissen, thought and being are one. Hegel was willing not only to face the death of God in the vanguard culture of his day, but he also had come to terms with the consequences Kant had hoped to avoid. Without a God's eye perspective, not only would the right not always trump the good, but morality would not always trump prudence. In the contemporary culture, being is only for us, and all categories, including all morality, are socially historically conditioned. Hegel realized that the very sense of morality had been transformed once it was after God. Without a transcendent God's eye perspective, law and public policy had by default become the higher truth of morality. Law and public policy are the reality of a society's effective norms. As a further consequence, the state becomes an immanent substitute for God. This restatement of morality as the ethics incarnate in and reduced to law and public policy provides the basis for Richard Rorty and the later John Rawls to have politics substitute for morality. After all, no one canonical morality can be identified, but laws can be established in the absence of a God's eye perspective to ground secular morality and bioethics. The state sustains the unity and specificity of a specific meaning of a society's norms by establishing those norms at law and in public policy. Although many saw the earlier Rawls as vindicating the powers of moral philosophy, by 1985, Rawls has retreated from the claim that his theory of justice, if he ever had the claim, had provided a generally justifiable moral defense of justice and fairness. He was left with advancing a political proposal. This state of affairs has vast implications for how one should understand the body, sexual activity, and reproduction. Within the dominant secular perspective, there's nothing to be said about the sanctification of the body as a result of an encounter with the transcendently holy, or concerning acts that defile, that preclude this contact with the holy. In liberal democracies, one has at best the requirement that one peaceably pursue one's sexual and reproductive goals, whatever they may be, with concerning others within the constraints of law. But what should those constraints be? In the absence of philosophies being able to establish canonical moral constraints, that is, after the immanization, which Hegel recognized, there is nothing that can be specifically affirmed for persons in general. One has at best a thin aesthetic to replace moral norms. One's body is whatever one makes of it within the horizon of the finite and the immanent. It is persons who weave a narrative about their bodies, not bodies that set non-negotiable limits to these narratives. At the beginning of the 21st century, Athens, the Western moral philosophical project of attempting to understand how persons should act in terms of norms supposedly justified through sound rational argument, has in the public culture consumed Jerusalem. The constraints set by the holy on the good, the right, and the virtuous are no longer recognized. In addition, this moral philosophical project failed. It has not secured a canonical moral vision. This state of affairs notwithstanding, the insights of traditional Jews and Christians, whose insights have been secured independently of any philosophical reflection, have nevertheless, within the dominant culture, been substantively transformed. This transformation occurred through a radical change of perspective. Traditional Christians had understood the good, the right, and the virtues, indeed persons and their bodies, in terms of the holy. Moreover, the holy was encountered and experienced as radically different from and independent of being, for us, created being. It was in terms of this encounter that with the transcendent, that traditional Christians had acknowledged the significance of the sanctification as well as the defilement of the body. This acknowledgement had nested a set of norms regarding sexual activity and reproduction in an appreciation beyond human narratives, but rather set in terms of the divine narrative into which humans have been placed. In the dominant culture, in its lifework, this entire perspective has collapsed. All of this traditional Christian perspective is gone. It is not just that the habits of the ancient fasts that connected life and the body with the pursuit of sanctification are gone. For example, the idea of an Advent fast within which, among other things, marriages do not take place, no longer has a foothold in the dominant culture. Indeed, the dominant culture is now secularized in being set fully within the horizon of the finite and immanent. The meaning of the body is to be fabricated through various lifestyle choices that nest the body within various free-floating narratives. The body, along with sexuality and reproduction, becomes what one peaceably makes of them with consenting others. That is, humans are rather recognized as rights and dignity bearers who, with other humans, are at liberty peaceably to constitute the meaning of their bodies with consenting others. In the contemporary dominant culture, an appreciation of the body as it had been recognized in traditional Christianity is gone. The body has been relocated within a culture in which an agnostic, if not an atheistic methodological postulate dominates. All is to be appreciated as if it were ultimately meaningless, receiving only provisional meaning from our narratives. In particular, the body is no longer acknowledged as central to the human project, encountered with a radically transcendent God who conveys sanctification and through whom there is the resurrection of the body. I thank you for your extreme patience with my voice.
Providing commentary to Professor Engelhardt's paper is my colleague in the Department of Theology, Gary Anderson, who is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible. His interests concern the religion and literature, particularly of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, with special interest in the reception of the Bible in early Judaism and Christianity. That said, his interests span the entire Bible, but most recently, he has put special focus on the book of Genesis as well as priestly literature. He is also interested in biblical narrative, canonical exegesis, biblical theology, Jewish culture and religion, and Jewish and Christian relations. And if that's not enough, he's also a pretty good touch football player. Gary Anderson.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your presentation, and especially, I think, a much needed emphasis on the relationship of the body to the idea of sanctification, concepts of the holy, and the way in which our bodies then become expressions of our Christian identity, all themes I think that are worthy of being sounded and plumbed again and again. In terms of my own remarks, I guess I'm going to focus on 2 points at which I had difficulties, perhaps the first one more and a result of my own learning or lack of learning in the history of philosophy. But let me begin with that. I have to confess, I'm not sure I followed all of the particulars that Dr. Engelhardt was making regarding the work of Kant and Hegel, and that, I will fully confess, may simply be the result of my own intellectual limitations. It seems that Dr. Engelhardt believes that since they are responsible, in part, or maybe even indeed in large part, for the disenchantment of the modern world, and so the loss of the holy, because of Kant and Hegel, or through Kant and Hegel's thought, we can come to an understanding of the modern breakdown of marriage law, maybe most specifically specified by the poignant example he gave at the beginning of his lecture. This, however, I must confess, does not seem quite right to me. Marriage and family, it seems to me, were not terribly changed in the wake of the figures of Kant and Hegel. They remained, at least the institutions of marriage and family, relatively unchanged until the last several decades. He gives, in fact, a very powerful example of this at the beginning of his lecture with his own story of his wife's childbirth in Germany. I could give another story. I'm sure many of us could give our own stories, but when I was in grade school, and contrary perhaps to how I appear, I don't think of myself as old, but in any event, perhaps I am. In my years in grade school, from kindergarten through graduation in the 12th grade, I can honestly say that among all my peers, I knew not a single family in which the parents were divorced. Now, it probably was the case that there were individuals, families within my high school where there were divorced parents, but I've always found it a striking feature of my background that I went through high school completely unaware of any example of the same. If one fast forwards a couple of decades to the time in which I'm raising my own children, of course the experience is quite different. I can remember, in fact, taking my son to the daycare center where they regularly celebrated Mother's Day with all the children, but they always ignored Father's Day because it was going to be too much of an embarrassment to the kids in the classroom who didn't have fathers. So a really extraordinary change in the cultural landscape of contemporary America witnessed in at least the background stories of our two lives. In any event, I guess what I felt having read this lecture and now heard it is I think we need a deeper account of what generated these consequences in the last three decades or so. Perhaps it is, in fact, simply the outworking of what Kant and Hegel thought. If so, there's an enormous gap in the way in which this was going to play out culturally that I think is worthy or requires some extended explanation. So that's my first point. I think my uneasiness at tracing back our contemporary problems simply to the work of Kant and Hegel. Secondly, but perhaps more significantly, I'm puzzled, and I would have to say also somewhat troubled by what seems to be an underlying fideism in the argument of this paper. Oftentimes I felt as though it represented maybe more what the Amish would want to say about marriage and family than what Eastern Christians would want to say, at least Eastern Christians that I know. On page 7, he says, quote, that outside the church, the gospel is a sealed and incomprehensible book, end of quote. By this, he seems to mean that the church has nothing to say about the dissolution of sexual mores in the present day that modern ears can absorb. We have paganism, in other words, on one side of the divide and the church on the other, and there's no conversation in between. As I read this statement, I couldn't help but think, again, being someone whose special interest is the Old Testament, of the story of Abraham and his sojourn in Gerar, a non-Israelite community in Genesis 20, in which Abraham perhaps regrettably tells the king in Gerar, Avimelech, that his wife is really his sister, and Avimelech then on those grounds takes Abraham's wife to his bedroom. In this story, it says in verse 3 that God came to Avimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she's a married woman." Now Avimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he, that is Abraham, not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? I did this in the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands." And God replied to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now, therefore, return the man's wife, for he's a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die." So Avimelech gets up the next morning and calls in Abraham, obviously a little bit angry at having been misled. He says to Abraham, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you, that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? What were you thinking that you did such a thing?" And then Abraham's response is actually quite crucial here. He says, "I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place." And that's the sentence I really want to focus on. And of course, it was of great interest to many Jewish exegetes as well, because Abraham had this presumption that moral life, the grounds of the moral life, simply are not regnant outside the bounds of the elected people. And the story clearly indicates that the constraints, at least of sexual morality, are knowable outside the domain of revelation. And it's stories like that, and I think certainly Judaism's and Christianity's reflection on stories like this. How can the church's sexual mores, or the mores revealed by revelation, be known somehow generally outside the bounds of synagogue or church, which generates a philosophical concern for knowledge of the moral law outside of the domain of revelation? That makes me uneasy with this statement that outside the church, the gospel is a sealed and incomprehensible book. It's as though, or what I fear Dr. Engelhardt is saying, is that we have nothing to say to the world around about us with respect to moral teaching that they both can understand and be accountable to. So that's point A of my second point. Point B follows in due course. He goes on then to emphasize the role of the liturgy as a site of divine revelation. Again, a point with which I have considerable sympathy, but not completely in the direction in which he's going to take it. He writes, quote, "For those outside of Orthodox Christianity, the eschewal of philosophical argument, even systematic analysis, may seem at best arbitrary. there seems to be a happiness with the notion that somehow, again, revelation here through the mediation of liturgy it conveys or comes with an eschewal of philosophical argument. There's no need for philosophical argument. So, in essence, what we have from the first example is that there's no gospel for those outside the church, and for those within the church, there's no recourse to philosophy. Well, I find this troubling and astonishing. Do we really want to say such a thing? Let's think just for a moment about the laws regarding suicide. Here we have a sin against the body of the highest possible order. At one time in the history of both synagogue and church, the seriousness of this sin meant that someone who had committed suicide would be, by definition, prevented from having a Jewish or Christian burial. You can see the significance of this motif in Shakespeare's Hamlet, for example. However, we've learned in the modern era that suicides are not what we once thought them to be. They're not a freely willed act in which an individual denies the supreme gift that God has given him or her. Modern science has shown us that suicides generally are governed by a very troubled depression and mental situation. And as a result, both within the church and in the synagogue, individuals who commit suicide still remains a sin, of course, but pastoral concerns and modern science, philosophical reflection on modern science has led to a quite significant change in canon law and the way in which this particular moral problem is going to be handled. And I think we can see the same thing present with respect to homosexuality. The church still, that is the Catholic Church, still frowns on the practice or the act, the homosexual act itself, but it's changed its position dramatically regarding matters like sodomy laws or civil unions, in large part because the church has come to realize that homosexual acts are not simply freely chosen decisions calibrated against the teaching of the church. The church's teachings on these moral matters and how to adjudicate them is very much open to philosophy and what we might call systematic analysis. We don't simply repeat what we find in the Bible or canon law. We adjust on the basis of what we learn to be true from modern philosophy or science. Given Dr. Engelhardt's retreat to the liturgy and the liturgy alone, I guess I wondered within the context of his paper how he can account for developments such as this. Thank you.
If my voice serves me, let me quickly give a few responses.
Please.
First, I never talked about the body as an expression of Christian identity. That's a way of talking about it, at odds with the notion of the sanctification of the body. The quote about the gospel is a closed book was from Archimandrite Vesalius, where he more or less quotes again Irenaeus of Lyon. So it was a way in which one looked at the gospel for a large period of Christian history, and still is the mainstream Orthodox understanding. What I was trying to point out is that Orthodox Christian theology is primarily an empirical endeavor where one points out this really is there. It's, to have a philosopher help you with it, I used to practice medicine, would be like someone trying to do a metaphysical deduction of Pseudomonas pneumonia. It would be beside the point. Now, as to suicide, the first canon of the Orthodox Church, at least, speaking to insanity being a cause of suicide, is the 3rd century. It's part of the canons of Pope Timothy of Alexandria. So the idea that many suicides, surely not all, were due to mental reason problems is surely nothing new. The issue that if you had a great deal of difficulty controlling your passions, you might not be as culpable for sin. It goes back to the 3rd century. I mean, there are large texts on that. My wife said, large texts on that in the Egyptian fathers. So it's beside the point to make that reference. That's old stuff in the reflection on how we, besides, penances in the early church had nothing to do with punishment. They had to do with treatment. So the question was, what kind of penance would help you come to terms with your passions? So it was not juridical, but medicinal. Now, I just don't agree with you that we share enough premises with some people in order to have a conclusion come from sound rational arguments. Here I agree with Agrippa. You have to have basic premises and rules of evidence in common. When you don't, you argue in a circle, have an infinite regress, but you never come to a common conclusion. And there I think Fatima is right. Generally, the idea that there's something wrong with having sexual intercourse outside of marriage or reproducing outside of marriage is inaccessible to large parts of the contemporary culture. All the philosophical arguments in the world won't work to the people who share the same premises. You also must read why I mentioned Kant and Hegel. Not that they immediately caused or brought about what Gianni Vattimo, sort of neo-Hegelian, talks about the importance of sex going away. But they pointed out a radical change. They both reflected and contributed to it, the way in which Western Europe looked at what traditional Christianity had attempted to endorse. Kant tried to deduce everything so that masturbation was similar to suicide. Hegel said that won't work. Now, I shouldn't even mention one of the differences between Hegel and Kant. Kant, as far as we know, never gave illegitimate issue. Hegel's first son is a bastard, and he felt no guilt about it. So he's living in an elite intellectual culture that will only later have an impact on what the latter part of the 20th century and 21st century. I mean, one might think about David Icke, who, there were Jews at the beginning of the 19th century who wanted to join up with Protestants who had both lost their faith, saying, can't we share our loss of faith together and have a community? Okay. That's what Kant and Hegel already identified, which has not yet become widely appreciated until where we are. But as to Hegel, wow, there are almost as many interpretations of Hegel as there are Hegelians. I obviously, as I think I put in the footnote, agree with Klaus Hartmann. That was a long response, but it turns on quite different images of Christianity and of what role philosophical argument will play.
Okay, before we go on, we have only about 5 minutes, and we want to give an opportunity for people who very patiently listen to commentary and the lecture. I'd like to invite anyone who would like to pose a question. There are microphones on each side of the room. If you could please approach, just let us know who you are and ask a relatively succinct question at this point. Anyone like to pose a question? Yes, sir.
William Stegall from University of Dallas, Medical City, apparently not as informed a Texan as Dr. Engelhardt. Aren't you, I have a problem with the term you're using, demoralization. So you said the body has been demoralized, sexual choices have been demoralized. And I wonder if really what you're getting at is desacramentalized. No. The idea, so morality is of the will of choice, so therefore any choice then is going to have a moral component to it. No. And so it may be that philosophers no longer understand the moral nature of the body, but that cannot be true of modern culture because there's probably no other more important choice that modern culture thinks about. For example, thinking about how much time people spend on their body, their other's body, sexuality, how much time and energy is devoted to that. People are thinking about it a lot, and they're making choices on it.
Sure. What I meant by the demoralization of the body, how you use it peaceably with consenting others, is not a subject of a universal judgment that you've done rightly or wrongly, good or bad. It's a lifestyle choice. It's been removed from being a moral choice. Now the University of Dallas is probably very pure and your students are different from mine. But the hookup culture has come to rise. And you should read recent books on the hookup culture. There is, if you argue with those people, they don't share the premises that existed even when the atheist Immanuel Kant wrote. So it's demoralized. Kant wanted to moralize religion. Hegel, for the most part, is willing to demoralize a whole range of choices, and that develops further, and it is the culture of the modern campus.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that it's an activity of the modern campus, an activity of modern culture, but just because it is doesn't mean that people are no longer concerned about it. And
They're not.
well, the literature. So listen to any pop station, and those songs are going to be riddled with angst and fear and trepidation because of what's going on.
That doesn't make your point. I mean, you can have all kinds of angst and trepidation about a lifestyle choice. Should I be a lawyer? Should I be a physician? That's not a moral choice, but that can be riddled with angst. So that people feel that angst, I don't disagree. But what characterizes our culture is we don't share basic premises. As Clement of Alexander said, there's no way philosophy can give us the basic premises. Unless you have them, we won't agree. We'll argue in a circle, have an infinite regress,
Okay, we have a
or beg the question.
Question.
Philosophy's dog doesn't hunt.
question over here.
Hello, yes, my name is Kale Majaz, and I'm a student from The Ohio State University. I have one question about how we can even have discussion then, because I think you're fundamentally right in your assessment that when we have different premises, we're going to argue in circles. So given today that the Christian worldview is really radically different from the worldview and philosophical foundations of the secular culture, how would you suggest we engage in conversation?
Very simple.
Typically, in the past, the bridge between Christian ethics and Christian rationality and I don't know, just rationality or the way or different philosophical systems has been through teleology. So could you just comment on what you think a good bridge would be for communication between the worldviews?
The same thing that worked in the first 3 centuries. Become holy, and the whole world around you will change. Seraphim of Sarov was asked by a young man, what should I do to change the world? And the Saint Seraphim said, gain the Holy Spirit and thousands of people around you. The idea that you should argue people to be Christians is nonsense. Theoretically, they don't have the same premises. And anyone who's tried it will see it fails. What converted people of the first 3 centuries was awesome holiness.
If I could presume on the chair's privilege, I have a question which goes in a little bit of a different direction. I'm just curious to get your response to it. If we were to substitute the language of body with the language of nature, and everything you describe about the way in which people now view the body in terms of a lifestyle choice, a vessel we can use for our own pleasure and disposal. What strikes me about the argument is that in today's contemporary liberal society, increasingly the liberal society regards the body as a vessel of any and all kinds of activities that give us pleasure, but increasingly the natural world as a realm filled with all kinds of normative assumptions about how we can and can't dispose of it, so the rise of the environmental movement. So I'm wondering how, in some ways, what seems to be a certain kind of incompatibility between the presumptions about how we use and dispose of the body for our individual pleasure, and how we use and how we are not to be used and dispose of the natural world for our pleasure, would conform to your argument about the rise of sort of philosophic libertinism.
Sure. There are two independent issues. Let me start with nature.
Not for Aristotle, but go ahead.
Thank God I'm not an Aristotelian.
That may be the source of all of these critiques.
But as to nature, when you no longer understand that God has made men to have dominion over nature, you go back to the romanticism of the Germans in the 19th century, of a lot of the associates of Hitler. You're going out, seeing nature, you're connecting with something that's independent of you. Traditional Christians and my grandchildren, I have a lot, or I tell them to read the hunting license given by the Lord God to Noah and his sons, chapter 9 of Genesis, and they will be afraid of you, the animals, as you come to kill them and eat them. That's a notion of hierarchy. That's a revealed view. Once that collapses, nature arises as an idol, as it did in the 19th century, and does for those people. But the body is an issue of sanctification, because as a fact, if you've ever encountered a holy father or holy mother, that's not an expression of Christian identity. That is the presence of the uncreated energies of God.